Greetings, everyone. I've always wanted to have a good vegetable garden, a productive garden, one where we humans actually get to consume some of the produce that we grow instead of becoming a plant-only charcuterie board for the local wildlife. Now, I've tried before, and I've only succeeded in fattening up the local deer, rabbits, raccoons, squirrels, and occasional turkeys that happen by. Well, a few months back, I decided it was time to try again. So I did a little bit of research, then took the dive. It turned out pretty well, I think. Let's talk about how I constructed our new vegetable garden. Come on in. Again, greetings everyone, and welcome to Keeping Up with Papa, Life After Work, where we explore how one man manages to keep busy after retirement with projects. We're recording again today from inside my temporary recording studio, our camper. You know what? This is kind of growing on me. It's a pretty easy setup. It sounds acceptable. I'm fooling around a little bit with lighting, but that's getting better. Hey, it's funny, last episode I was a little bit on the orange side, and people were telling me I should probably get my thyroid checked. Anyway, it's nice here. There are no distractions. I might keep using it. Folks, with today's subject, I may be risking my vlogging future a bit because I am stepping into a minefield, and that minefield is gardening. Yep, or more specifically, vegetable gardening. Now, why do I call this a minefield? Well, gardening is a very popular subject, right? And frankly, well, hey, I'm no expert. Everyone seems to have their own opinion on how to go about it. So, just out of curiosity, I Googled how many gardening videos are there on YouTube? And the answer was 1,500. What? Nah, that can't be right. Only 1,500? No, but there were over 47 million hits. And what that tells me is that gardening vids on YouTube are so popular that even the YouTube algorithms are afraid to venture down that path. Like I said, it's a minefield. Well, with that said, why in the world would I post gardening advice anyway, since I'm clearly just a gardening novice, and potentially why would I risk all the expert gardeners' ire? Well, I'm not. Not yet anyway. I'm not here to tell you how to garden. I'm only here, at least for this one episode, to share with you how I built our garden. So let's talk about what I did. Hey, it seems to be my modus operandi, and by the way, I looked that up, and that is Latin for M-O. So it seems to be my M-O. I began building my knowledge base via Google and via YouTube. Now, from various videos and websites, I started putting together a picture in my head of what I might like to have. And it turns out the first decision I had to make was, well, where? Where am I going to put the garden? Now, when it comes to where to put a garden, I have a serious problem that most people don't have. I have plenty of space. But what I didn't have was space with enough available sunlight. Our property is very heavily wooded, and honestly, I don't like cutting down trees. But it just so happens that some months before, I had been selectively clearing on the east side of the driveway with the intent of being able to get the mower in between the trees. Yeah, I know it's a bad idea, but I did it anyway. I mean, simple common sense says that the more you clear, the more you have to maintain, right? So don't do it. But I did, which meant that just south of the pole barn, I had a mostly open area, or at least a potentially open area, that might work for a garden. This could be an ideal location. Why? So I had water not too far away, and I could pretty easily extend those lines. And with a little additional clearing, I would have open sky much of the morning and pretty much all of the afternoon. And the trees were fairly small, something that I could easily clear myself without having to hire someone to do it. So I did. Now that gave me plenty of space and what I feel to be is an acceptable amount of sunlight for a vegetable garden. Next, I needed to figure out garden beds. So what were my options? Well, there really were only two that I seriously considered. One was raised beds, and the other was tall raised beds. Well, hey, that was a no-brainer. I mean, I'm no longer a spring chicken, and crawling around on my knees when I don't have to plant and to weed and to harvest doesn't really appeal to me anymore. So again, after poking around a bit on Google and YouTube, I decided on tall raised beds. So I decided to build beds that are 28 inches high. Easy to work? Very easy. And there would be 3 of them to start, each of them 4 feet by 8 feet in dimension. So next was, well, exactly where? I mean, not just where, but down to the inch where. Well, I started out by laying it all out on paper, and then I physically laid out the grid that I had in my mind on the ground that I had previously cleared using stakes and strings, just to be sure that what showed up on paper worked well in the space allotted. The final size, outside fence dimensions, ended up being about 22 feet by 34 feet. Nice size. Hey, making progress. Next, how to build the 4x8 beds. Again, hey, looking at Mr. Google and Mr. YouTube, I found a rough design that I liked, then I reverse engineered it to figure out how to build it. Reverse engineered, got that? Hey, that's a smart aleck way of saying that I used somebody else's design. Hey, to my credit though, I did have to figure out all the dimensions for lumber cuts. Well, I had already decided that I wanted these to be corrugated tin insides on a 2x4 frame. I like the look, and overall it's really not all that expensive. So the tin sheets, they are actually corrugated roofing, and they're available at most of your big box hardware stores. And they come in a 26-inch width and various lengths. So I figured out if I were to buy 8-footers, I could cut one of those in half, then I'd have 2 sheets at 4 feet to use as the end pieces, and then I could use 2 more sheets at 8 feet on the sides, and then I would have all 4 sides for my 4x8 box from 3 sheets of tin. These were in the range of about $30 a piece, a little bit less. So I think, from a price standpoint, they're dead on. It was perfect. Next, though, was lumber. Wow, lumber cost at that time was crazy expensive. And, what kind should I get? I mean, I could use treated or I could use untreated, right? Of course, treated wouldn't last a whole lot longer, but it has the potential of leaching nasty chemicals into the garden soil. Untreated, well, it may not last as long. I didn't want to be doing this over and over. My conundrum was resolved by my neighbor, who had just torn down an old dock, and he had an excess of free dock lumber laying on his beach, and he wanted it gone. Hey, very quickly I talked myself into treated and felt very comfortable with the final decision because, well, A, the lumber had been at dock for 10 plus years, so a lot of the chemicals should have already leached out, right? B, it would be frame material only, and there would be minimal exposure to the soil, as the soil would mostly be touching just the tin. C, I would be painting it, and paint would help trap anything unpleasant. And D, it was free. Hey, free trumps everything, right? Hey, free, not a hard decision. So I gathered my materials and I started construction. Now, for some reason, I didn't really take that many pictures, but I'm recreating what I can for you. And just so you know, what I did was I laid out the design on paper. Then I cut all the individual pieces needed to build one frame. I then laid those out in an assembly pattern on the floor of the pole barn, and then I assembled each side using deck screws. Then I stood the assembled sides up, screwed those together, and had a completed frame. Once everything was cut, hey, it really didn't take very long at all. It worked out great, so I cut and assembled the other two. Now, the free dock lumber, well, that had been previously painted. It was all faded and beat up, so I took a piece of the painted scrap lumber down to the local Ace Hardware, and I had them match the paint color, and then I painted the frames. And after the paint dried, I dropped the tin in place, I screwed it in from the inside, and then I cut a brace for the middle to help stop all that heavy soil from bowing out the sides. You can't see it, but that brace is buried about halfway down, and it ties together the two long run sides via that center vertical brace board. It's just all screwed together. Worked really, really well. Hey, one more word on the tin. Now, there are two versions available. They have a dull finish and they have a bright finish. Well, I wanted a dull finish, right? So I went to both Home Depot and Lowe's websites, and both of them showed dull finish and bright finish available. In both cases, when I got to the store, all they had was bright finish. And let me tell you something, when the sun hits that bright finish and it reflects, it is bright. I'm hoping it tarnishes a bit over the next few years. If not, I may end up painting it some dark color. So, now, following assembly, I dropped the 3 raised beds into their final resting places, I squared them off to each other, and I leveled them. Because, well, apparently, if you listen to Sigmund Freud, I have what he called an anal retentive personality. I don't know, it's got something to do with potty training as a toddler. I'd rather not go there. Hey, but if you listen to modern psychologists, I am, at least to some degree, what they currently call simply obsessive compulsive. Hey, and that's in vogue right now. And it sounds a whole lot better, so I'm sticking with that. Regardless, hey, my mind demanded that these be really square and that they be plumb, so that's what I did. Anyway, next, I then proceeded to fill them with what? Well, hey, this is a big question. These are not just low-to-the-ground beds where you can go down to the Ace Hardware and pick up a few bags of garden soil and be done with it. No, there's major volume here. This required special consideration. So, back to Mr. Google, back to YouTube. Now, I discovered that prior to dropping in soil, most other gardeners with raised beds this tall, they would fill the beds about halfway up with stuff like cardboard and yard waste and lumber scraps, leftover logs and sticks and leaves, whatever they could find that was biodegradable. Then they would dress off the top with garden soil and compost. Then, as time passes, the base material underneath decomposes and becomes what? More compost. Perfect. Well, turns out that we have a 4-acre scrapwood factory and multiple neighbors with exactly the same thing. So I used everything I could find from our property. I then raided the neighbor's property while they weren't paying attention, and sure enough, in a few hours, I had all 3 bins half full. I then went out and raked up a whole bunch of leaves and debris, and I dumped that in to fill in all the gaps as best as possible. Then, using that sweet little subcompact Kubota tractor, I added compost. And finally, on the top, to dress it off, a few bags of composted manure. Now, you might wonder, where did I get that much compost? Well, my first option, we actually have a local gardening material supply not too far away that sells it by the yard, and it's really not too expensive. Only about $30 a yard, which I think is pretty cheap. But check this out. So as I mentioned, it is a large piece of property, and I keep a section up in the woods where I just keep materials for gardening and so forth. This pile you see here has been collecting for the last 20 years. It's really an old pile of leaves. I just keep dumping them there, and they decompose and become earth. And I've used about 2/3 of it here in the last couple of years. This second pile of compost is from the next door neighbors. He spreads pine bark all over his yard. And after a while, that degrades so badly it becomes really slick. So he had me pick it up, a whole bunch of it that they typically drive on. And I brought it over here, and I've been using that for compost as well. And that works exceptionally well. You can see that I'll throw various materials like old lettuce and stuff up here, and there's a bunch of citrus back there. What the deer don't eat gets composted down into the compost piles. So this was my source, these two, for the garden. I mixed the two together. The result? 3 beautiful 4x8 raised beds filled with rich compost and soil and ready for planting. Nice. Step 1 was done. But what would be the point if the deer cleaned me out in a single evening, which they absolutely would, given the opportunity? I needed a fence. So, cue again, my neighbor. My next door neighbor has been successfully gardening for years with no deer damage. All he uses, and this still really amazes me because some people go to just incredible lengths and expense to keep deer out. All he uses is a simple, lightweight vinyl grid fencing that's available at local hardware stores. His version comes in a roll that's 7 feet tall. They can't jump over it, too tall. As my luck at the time would have it, which seemed to be running pretty darn well, he had several rolls left over. And just like with the lumber, he gave me all I needed. Now, he ties this off to tall metal fence posts. These are those kind that you drive into the ground, and they're available at the local Tractor Supply or other big box stores like that. Instead, I decided I wanted something just a little more formal, so instead of those metal fence posts, I bought treated pine 4x4s, 10 feet tall, and dropped those into the ground. Then, based on another friend's garden that I'd been poking around, looking for ideas, I chamfered the fence corners on one end, or one corner actually, to 45 degrees where the gate was going to be, just because I liked the look. And then I made the gate entrance plenty big for a wheelbarrow to go in and out, and I set my post and built the gate. Again, final dimensions, 22 feet by 34 feet. I allowed an extra 7 feet on each end of the raised beds so that later I could add more beds, running along the fence line. And that's something I'm already tinkering with right now. The posts went in just using post hole diggers and just into dirt. I didn't put in any concrete footers. There's not a lot of stress on them, so I didn't see any point in doing that. Now, I thought it might be best also to lay down some landscape fabric, as mowing at some point in the future didn't really seem practical, and I didn't want to fool with it. So down went 4-foot wide landscape material. It's appropriately overlapped, and then a couple of inches of small pine bark to dress it off and to keep me from tripping over the seams. Again, it's really nice having that subcompact tractor. The fence was just stapled in place, and it's performed like a champ. 6 months later, no successful deer incursions, or rabbits for that matter. Although I'm kind of curious if one could actually jump up 2.5 feet to get into that garden. Now later, I ran water lines inside the fence, and while I was at it, I ran multiple other lines nearby. I'll save that for a later episode. But for now, I'm just using a sprinkler to water. Now, there are all kinds of options suggested online for watering, and mostly it's some form of drip irrigation. But for the moment, what I'm doing is fine. We had a fall test garden just to see how well plants would grow. Now, initial growth, my gosh, it was fantastic. Hey, but later in the season, it was bug city, and they pretty much destroyed most of what I was growing in short order. I really need to learn about pest control. About that time, I decided to start a winter garden, and that did really, really well. Now, since there's mostly just debris in the bottom half of each one of these raised beds, there's going to be some settling because the debris decomposes, right? Well, as I change crops for the season, and I've already been doing this, I simply amend the soil with more compost and bring things back up. It actually dropped really about this much, maybe 2 inches, in the brief period of time that I'd had it active. Now that will likely continue for at least the next several years, probably permanently. Well, there you have it, my garden construction. At some point in the not too distant future, I'll talk about adding more raised beds, which, as I said, I've already started doing, and taking a somewhat different approach while I do it. And I'll talk about what we planted and how well that does. Or doesn't. And that's it. Short and sweet. Let's close out with the 3 E's. I hope you found this entertaining, informative, and educational. As always, comments are welcome. Please share and subscribe. I'll see you next time on Keeping Up with Papa, Life After Work.